Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I will show you how you can use your ASI120 color camera, the older version with a USB 2, on a Raspberry Pi running Astroberry. This is a setup that I have been using, and I want to build a remote observatory based on that setup, so I need that up and running. And I have an older ASI120 USB 2 camera, and I don't want to get a new USB 3 version, so there has to be a workaround. It hasn't been easy to find one, especially given the forums and the discussions there saying that there isn't a solution. Even ZWO says that these camera don't work well with the Linux devices, and since the Pi runs Linux, it has some problems with that. But there is a workaround, and I'll walk you through that today. My setup here is comprised of a laptop running Windows and SharpCap 3.2. I'm using that to connect to my Pi and also to demonstrate how the ASI120 color camera works on Windows with SharpCap. My Pi setup has two USB 2 ports and two USB 3 ports. We will be using the USB 2 port for our experiments, and some other accessories if you wish. I have micro SD card, a case with a cooling fan, and a GPS dongle running on USB. This is my system. You can see the casing. The cooling fan is inside here, and I have the GPS dongle on the USB 2 port. Now this is all nice and easy, and it's a lot cheaper than the ASI Air version that the guys from ZWO sell. So to proceed, we have to download and update the firmware on the ASI camera. To do that, you just go to the ZWO website and get the latest firmware updates for the Windows machine. It's important to do the updates on the Windows machine. And once you download the archive and unzip it, you'll find two folders, one for the USB 2, one for the USB 3. Use the one for the USB 2 when you update the firmware, and we should be using the compatible version, not the one dedicated to the 120MC camera. That one doesn't work on Linux, so we have to stick with the compatible version. I will be showing both just for you to get an idea of the differences between them. So just to remind you, you do need to use the Windows installer. Click on the firmware update button. That should take you to the firmware files, and use the compatible one. And you must use the USB 2 port for that. Things to remember: to work with Astroberry on Pi4, you have to double check the firmware that you have used on Windows and update that to the compatible firmware if you've used the dedicated one. It will not work otherwise, and I'll show you what happens if you use the dedicated one on the Linux machine, on the Pi4. All right, let's get started then and see how we can update our firmware and how we can test it on both Windows and the Pi4. I have my ASI120MC installed, and I will use the dedicated firmware to test it on the Linux, the Pi4, and on the Windows machine, just for you guys to see the difference. So I'm going to click on firmware update, and I'm going to select the dedicated one. Firmware updated successfully, and just to be sure, rescan for the cameras, and I'm going to connect it. We do need to play a bit with the exposure times. Let's bring it down to about 4 milliseconds. The gain 37 looks good. All right, so there it is, all good, running nice and smooth. So now let's try it on the Pi machine. For that, I am running Astroberry Local, the desktop version here, and as you can see, not much memory being used, and CPU as well. I'm going to use OA capture for the task at hand. Now, I found that it's good to have these closed and open them after you actually connect the camera. Otherwise, things get stuck, the windows freeze. It's not a good experience. You need to refresh the browser, and then that kind of gives you back some of the functionality and control, and you need to close the windows and restart them. So the best way is to try to turn everything off and start from there. So I'm just going to unplug my MC camera, and I'm going to plug it in the USB 2 port. The differences between the ports is that the USB 3 versions are blue. The two versions are black. So I'm just going to plug this into the black USB 2 port. And that's it. It's all there. And now let's try to start the OA capture. All right. I'm using the task manager just to monitor the usage of the CPU and memory. And let's try to connect the camera. The camera is connected. I should be seeing some sort of images. Let's switch to the RGB 24-bit channel. As you can see, nothing happens. And this is the big problem that everybody experiences. They're trying to connect the camera on their Pis, and they don't get any image. You should see a live image, a live stream here. Frames per second is 0. Nothing happens. So this means that there is a problem. So to fix that, we need to use the compatible firmware. So we need to go back. I'm going to unplug this and plug it back into my laptop's USB 2 port. And go for the firmware again. So my sharp cap has also frozen. I could rescan for it. Yeah, everything should be fine, up and running. Just let's bring this down again to 4 here. Right, so let us update the firmware. Now, if you do this while the camera is running, you'll get problems with the sharp cap. So I will close the camera and update the firmware with the compatible one. So it's quite straightforward and fast. And let's rescan for the cameras and connect. All right, so it's all good, it's all back. And now we are using the compatible version. And I just want to show you here the frame rate. It's 19 frames per second and it's stable. Now, if you do experience issues with the compatible version on Windows, turn to the dedicated one when using Windows. I've used it a lot. It never drops below 19 frames per second in my case on the USB2. It's not the best frame rate, but it's not a bad one. As you can see, it's quite smooth. There aren't any issues or any delays in displaying the frames. So now let's go back to our sharp to our OA capture on the Pi. So I'm going to close it again, and I will do the maneuver again. So unplugging it from my laptop and plugging it back into the USB 2 port on my Pi4. All right, so remember now we are using the compatible firmware, not the dedicated one. So let's go back to the OA capture. Okay, and it sees the camera, which is excellent. Let's click on it, and there you go. Let's switch to the 24-bit channel. And there it is. So a nice view. It is a little bit slower in rendering than on Windows. You actually have, if you look here, less than half of the frame rate for the Windows machine. So we had a 19 frame rate. Now it's around 7.3 frame rate. So it's a little bit slower. It's not as smooth as on the Windows, but for instance, if you're doing a live stream on an object that you are tracking, users and viewers shouldn't see any difference, any major differences in anything. So don't worry about the lower frame rate. Now, I have observed that if you lower the exposure time, it will freeze your live stream. So I'm not entirely sure why that happens, but it does happen. So I will try to demonstrate it now. So the gain is roughly the same that we have on the Windows machine. We had the exposure was around 4 milliseconds. Now it's 33. This is why it's so bright. So what we need to do is lower that. Right, I'm going to lower it all the way to 10. And it looks good. It hasn't stopped anything. Right, everything is all right. A little bit slow. You can see it here. This is our OA capture, so it uses a little bit of the memory and a little bit of the CPU. Actually, it's the only major process running here. So it is slower, as you can see. Not the best rendering, but you are getting a live stream for the Pi from your old USB 2 sharp cap camera. Let us try to increase the exposure times back to around 33. It is better. So I did notice that if you decrease the exposure time enough, it freezes the live stream, and it actually freezes the software entirely. I'm going to do that now. So be very careful with low exposure times on the Pi4. So you'll see how it basically freezes up everything. I'm just going to try to get it down to a value similar to what we had on Windows. You see, it's the display is actually the problem, because the frame rates do look similar. Well, it hasn't caused any issues at this moment, which is good, but I have seen it freezing up the entire live stream. All right, let's move it up to about 30. Yeah, just about right. And it is a little bit better in terms of displaying the frame rate. So I'm not sure what the problem is, probably a firmware issue, a driver issue. Again, as I said, and as ZWO says, USB 2 is problematic on Linux, but this solution using the compatible firmware does solve a lot of problems, and it will make your older sharp cap USB 2 to work on the Raspberry Pi. That's all. See you in the next tutorial.